بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد. So alhamdulillah, as we mentioned, we started with Surah An-Nur today, which is the halfway point, or a little bit before the halfway point of the 29 juz. We read Surah An-Nur, we read Surah Al-Jinn, we read Surah Al-Muzammil and Surah Al-Muddathir, as well as Surah Al-Qiyamah. And inshallah, in the remainder of the salah, we'll read the rest of the 29th juz and also the first half of the 30th juz, so that we will end with Surah Al-Ghashiyah. And so tomorrow, inshallah, we'll start with Surah Al-Fajr. Yesterday, what we talked about was that the 28th juz was a predominantly Medinian juz. Like all of the surahs were revealed in Medina. And in contrast to that, or right after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings the 29th juz, which is filled with surahs that are all overwhelmingly Meccan. Right? So you can sense, again, the themes that are very common for the Meccan revelations. But what's also interesting is that the vast majority of these surahs were early Meccan revelations as well. So it's kind of an amazing thing about the Quran that you have these long sequences of surahs that have similar themes and similar structure that's there. So yesterday we saw all the Medinian surahs had a similar structure, and here also we see that the Meccan surahs have their own structure as well. We also know one of the things about the Quran is that the order that the Quran was revealed in is not necessarily the same order that the Quran is now compiled and was recited by the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. So one of the miracles of the Quran is that even though the 29th juz is almost at the end, these are surahs that actually were revealed at the beginning. But yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings them at the end as if to say that before you finish reading the entire Quran, here are these surahs that remind you of the gist and the most important lessons that you read previously in the previous Meccan surahs. So it's kind of a very interesting and a very well-placed sequence of surahs. The other thing that's interesting is that the sequence of surahs that comes, particularly starting with what we recited tonight, Surah An-Nur, and then Surah Al-Jinn, and then Muzammil and Muddathir, these four surahs is also very interesting because they again are connected in a very interesting way. And how they're connected is that the story of Nuh alayhi salam is really the main story that is told, but it's told in a dialogue form in this juz. Right? So there's a reference, for example, there's a reference to Yunus alayhi salam, which does come in Surah Al-Qalam, فَاصْبِرِ الْحُكْمِ رَبِّكَ وَلَا تَكُنْ كَصَاحِبِ الْحُوتِ, that have patience for the command of your Lord, and don't be, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, don't be like the companion of the whale, referring to Yunus alayhi salam. But it's interesting that Nuh alayhi salam is the only prophet that is mentioned by name in this entire sequence of surahs. So then you kind of ask yourself, well, what's the reason for that? There's so many other great prophets. There's Ibrahim alayhi salam was mentioned so many times. I mean, the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, which is the most common and most frequently repeated story of the Quran, is nowhere to be found in the 29th juz. So like, what gives? So the ulama point out, very interestingly enough, that the reason for why not only is the story of Nuh alayhi salam mentioned here, even though it's mentioned in other places, but the whole surah is about the conversation and the dialogue that Nuh alayhi salam has with his people. That's the whole surah. It's just a dialogue. The entire conversation that Nuh alayhi salam and his dua and his conversation that he has with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's what the whole surah is about. So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that just as your brother Nuh alayhi salam had to endure and had to be very creative and very persistent in his da'wah efforts. So one of the things Nuh alayhi salam says, قَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي دَعَوْتُ قَوْمِي لَيْلًا وَنَهَارًا. I called them night and by day. Right? وَلَمْ يَزِدْهُمْ دُعَائِي إِلَّا فِرَارًا. But my calling, it didn't increase them except they just ran away. They just escape. They fled, and they would put their fingers in their ears every time I would tell them to come back to Allah and to make istighfar. And then that I, ثُمَّ إِنِّي دَعَوْتُهُمْ جِهَارًا وَأَعْلَنْتُ لَهُمْ إِسْرَارًا, that I called them both openly, and I also called them in private gatherings as well. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is setting forth the table for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that just as your brother Nuh alayhi salam had to go through this, you too, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, will also have to go through a similar type of struggle with your people. Right? And so, and just as the people of Nuh alayhi salam said, we'll never give up, Wad and Su'a and Yahuth and these silly idols that they have, your people, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they also won't give up, Lat and Uzza and Manat and Hubal and all these other stupid idols that they have as well. So you see that there's again a parallel. But what's interesting is that at the end of the surah, Nuh alayhi salam actually makes dua against his people. He says, وَقَالَ نُوحُ رَبِّ لَا تَذَرْ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ دَيَّارًا. He literally says, don't leave any disbeliever on the earth. إِنَّكَ إِن تَذَرْهُمْ, if you just leave them alone, إِنَّكَ إِن تَذَرْهُمْ يَلِدْ, that they're just going to give birth to their offspring who won't believe. إِنَّكَ أَن تَذَرْهُمْ يُضِلُّ عِبَادَكَ, they're going to mislead your servants. وَلَا يَلِدُ إِلَّا فَاجِرًا كَفَّارًا, they're just going to give rise to more offspring that are not going to believe in you. So here, what's interesting, the ulama point out, is that Nuh alayhi salam, it took him a very, very long time to reach this point where he made dua against his people. But this is also a subtle reminder to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that don't make dua against your people, because if you do, Allah will grant it and your people will be destroyed. Right? So it's one of the mercies of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he never made dua against his people. His enemies, these same people who persecuted his companions, that tortured his companions, that made assassination attempts on his life, that kicked him out of Mecca and forced him to flee, and he had to take refuge in Medina. He never made dua against them. So that's the difference between Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Nuh alayhi salam. And then the next surah, which is Surah Al-Jinn, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then basically tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that remember that you're not sent just to human beings. That you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you're sent to the jinn as well. So whereas Surah An-Nur is a conversation of Nuh alayhi salam with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a vast majority of Surah Al-Jinn is a conversation that the jinns, when they heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam recite the Quran, that they had amongst themselves. So again, you see conversations that are put side by side in two surahs that come one after the other. And also, as if to tell the Prophet ﷺ that even if people may not believe in you right away, remember that you have your brethren from the jinn, right? Because the jinn are also part of the ummah, right, of Muhammad ﷺ. They do believe in you. So take heart, that be comforted that here as a group of creatures that are believing in you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then you have Surah Al-Muzammil and Surah Al-Mudaththir, which are essentially the opening portions of each of those surahs is the mission statement for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophethood. Right? Ya ayyuhal muzammil, qum al-layla illa qalila, that you who are enveloped in thy garments and in thy cloaks, that qum al-layla illa qalila, that stand up in the night except for a small portion of it. So early on, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for personal worship. And وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, so standing up in the night in prayer, qiyam and Qur'an. Right? Those were amongst the first commandments that were given to the Prophet ﷺ. And so what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is that this staying awake at night, it's difficult, but it will be the spiritual fuel that you will need to be able to do the affairs of the day. Because إِنَّ لَكَ فِي النَّهَارِ سَبْحًا طَوِيلًا, because verily for you in the daytime is a very long and difficult task, which is to go and to tell your people this message. So the only way that you can sort of, literally just fuel up for the journey is through qiyam, standing at night, and through Qur'an. So here, what we see, that what was told to the Prophet ﷺ, and as also is told to us as Muslims, is that you have to look after your inner and spiritual well-being on your own time, right, on your personal time, and you have to also look out for your civic and community affairs during the daytime. So, as a Muslim, you're responsible for both of these aspects of your lives. So you're responsible for the personal and spiritual aspect of your life, but you're also responsible for your responsibilities and whatever tasks and endeavors that you have to do at daytime. Right? So there's this dual balance that you're not just someone who lives in the world, but you're at the same time you're not somebody that is completely divorced from the world either. And then of course, Surah Al-Muddathir, which the majority opinion amongst most of the ulama, there's some ikhtilaf on this, but most of the ulama say that Surah Al-Muddathir was the second revelation. And this again tells the Prophet ﷺ, Ya ayyuhal muddathir, qum fa'anzir, wa rabbaka fakabbir, wa thiyabaka fatahhir. I mean, you can see it's almost a very poetic thing, like stand and warn, wa rabbaka fakabbir, and glorify your Lord, wa thiyabaka fatahhir, and purify your garments. And so early on there's the commandment for outward and inward cleanliness that Muslims also need to strive towards, right? So these, and we can talk a lot about the early verses or the first verses of Surah Al-Muddathir, but again you see that there's this mission statement that is being told to the Prophet ﷺ, which again incorporates both taking care of your inner personal and spiritual life, at the same time making sure that you don't neglect the responsibilities and duties that you have in your communal and day life as well. So in other words, like don't quit your day job. All right, that's what we as Muslims need to understand. That Islam is not a religion that requires you to quit your day job. Right? We need to be people that go and do our jobs to the best of our abilities. I mean, if you're a teacher, then be the best teacher that you can be. If you're a student, be the best student that you can be. If you're a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, I mean, someone who works at the IT department, I mean, whatever it might be. Like, be the best that you can during the day, but then don't forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it's your own personal time as well. So what's interesting again is that there's this division of the day which is naturally being created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being told to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that you need to divide your day into these blocks. And that's why it's also very interesting that if you look back even in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, which is the surah concerning the Friday prayers and the regulations, one of the things which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is that فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, that when the prayer is finished, then go and scatter in the land. Literally, go out into the land. وَابْتَغُوا مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ, and seek the bounties and the fadl of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As if to say, don't quit your day job. Again, like go back to your work. And remember Allah much while you're at work. وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. That remember Allah much so that perhaps you may be successful. So very early on, we see there is a melding of deen and dunya, which is being a very theoretical and an abstract commandment, which is in Mecca. And then in Medina, it actually comes together with concrete commandments. Right? So this is the beauty of deen. And this is very important because many times when people talk about religion, when they talk about reviving spirituality, there's almost this sense that when you're not at the masjid, or you're not at the halaqah, or you're not in the mahfil gathering or something like that, that when you're at your day job, when you're at school, that you're somehow in a religious or a lesser religious endeavor. Right? And of course, the masjid is the most religious place to be. We're not arguing that. But what we're trying to say is that don't neglect your responsibilities as well. That it is just as important for you to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at work as it is for you to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the masjid. Right? So that's the beauty of these early surahs, is that this is the message that Allah ta'ala is inculcating and implementing amongst the Sahaba. that this is what you need to do. And again, this is something that we need to keep in mind, because many people don't understand this and they don't fully appreciate this. We tend to compartmentalize Islam as something we do on Fridays or something we do in Ramadan or whatever it might be. But in reality, it's much more fluid, it's much more dynamic, and it's much more comprehensive than that. If Islam was simply just a set of rituals and what to do when you're in the masjid, right, then what's the difference between Islam and any other religion that also tells you how to worship God? Right? We're not here to say whether it's right or wrong, right, what the other religions say how to worship God, but other religions also have practices and habits that people can do to remember and to worship God in their own way. So what makes Islam different is that we have the ritual worship, but then we also have this overwhelming and overriding injunction that when you're in the daytime, that you should not neglect your affair there as well. That you should not forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there as well. And this is the theme, or one of the main themes, which kind of permeates these surahs which come in the 29th juz. There's much more that we can say, but inshallah that should be sufficient for tonight. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.